For a superhero of his popularity, video games based around DC Comics character The Flash have been notably few in number throughout its history. After making his game debut in 1993 on the SEGA Master System, his representation in video games declined sharply, with only a couple of exceptions like a Game Boy Advance beat-em-up by WayForward in 2006. Following that game's release, the rights to use the property in video games went up for sale. It would end up being Brash Entertainment, an up-and-coming new publisher that would seize this opportunity, set on making fans the Flash video game that they had been longing for. Brash was a company founded in 2007 with the goal of creating games using well-known movie, television, and comics licenses. Their intention was to produce projects that could hold their own against some of the most critically acclaimed games in the industry. These were supposed to be high-quality experiences that would rebuild consumer trust in tie-in games. To achieve this goal, Brash's people began scouting the developers that they thought would be best suited to their ever-expanding catalogue of IPs. For The Flash, they approached Bottle Rocket Entertainment. This was a developer that largely consisted of former Sony San Diego employees who had worked on cult PS2 action-adventure title The Mark of Kree. The members of Brash assigned to work on the project were avid fans of The Mark of Kree, in particular of its unique combat system that Bottle Rocket held the patent for. The management of Bottle Rocket had been desperately searching for a new project and jumped at the chance to work on it. By July 2007, development was underway for Xbox 360 and PS3, with a Nintendo Wii version planned too. Initial ideas for the game were fairly vague, but the developers knew that it would be an open-world game with a lineup of the Flash's most iconic villains. The exact scope of the open world, however, was subject to some back and forth. An early suggestion that was floated by the design team was to have the Flash zipping all over America to a number of different cities. These would have been notable locations associated with famous DC characters. He would be notified of another hero, for example Batman, needing assistance with an incident in Gotham, and would have to fast travel over there to help them deal with whatever crisis they were up against. This concept was quickly dropped, seen as being over-ambitious for their first attempt at the Flash. Creating multiple open worlds and executing them well would have been difficult to manage. Instead, they would focus their efforts on doing an open world which encompassed two neighbouring cities integral to the Flash, Central City and Keystone City. The general look of the setting, according to one artist, was inspired by The Incredibles and the original Mirror's Edge. Although the two separate cities were meant to look distinct from one another, it was designed to appear as though Central City had one foot in the future and Keystone had one foot in the past. Some of the earliest work on the project included a vast assortment of concept art showing the myriad of characters that they intended to work into the story, and some test animations. The game's plot was being handled mostly by Bottle Rocket's designers, some of whom were very familiar with the source material. It was also being overseen by veterans comics writer Marv Wolfman, known for his work on New Teen Titans and Crisis on Infinite Earths. While the designers tried to form a story that would work best for a video game project in terms of scale and structure, Wolfman was tasked with helping them fill in the details. The relationship between the three major parties involved in development, Bottle Rocket, Brash Entertainment, and Warner Bros. Proved amicable and functioned well. Warner Bros. And Brash supported the developers on the vast majority of their ideas, resulting in a healthy creative environment with plenty of freedom to experiment. One of Brash's only demands was that it would centre around the Wally West version of the Flash, who at the time was the prominent iteration of the character in the comic books. Brash and Bottle Rocket had a vision for their use of Wally in the game. It would be his equivalent of Batman's Year One story. It would be set within the first 12 months of his superhero outings, as he gets to grips with his abilities and the Flash's long list of pre-established rivals. Wally was not the only Flash in this universe, as he was picking up the mantle after Barry Allen, who was no longer around. The idea behind Wally starting the game as something of a rookie was to give the developers a device to gradually introduce new game mechanics to the player. As Wally continued to discover the extent of his powers, the player too would steadily learn more about how to use them. Much of development on the game was spent fine-tuning the controls and balancing accessibility with giving players a good level of control over the Flash. He could turn 180 degrees on a dime at the push of a button, and they were considering adding a 90-degree turn to the shoulder buttons, allowing him to change directions instantly. One developer I spoke to compared this to the light cycles from Tron. For the developers, encapsulating the sensation of moving at high speed was top priority. They spent months tweaking the mechanics, trying to find how to make it feel right. Initially, they thought that slowing down everything in the Flash's environment when he was in motion might be a good way to accurately portray his powers. However, upon experimenting, they realized that it failed to convey the thrill of speed to the player. Moving past objects like cars while they were suspended in slow motion might have been more comic accurate, but the developers arrived at the conclusion that this simply wasn't as fun as having them move normally. A greater impression of speed was created demonstrated by having the vehicles move at their standard pace as they rushed past the player. The only times when a slow-mo effect would be activated were when the Flash reached his absolute fastest setting or pulled off a special attack. Eventually, they settled on several different levels of speed for the Flash's movement that the player could cycle through. This started with a standard walking pace, moving up to the speed of an Olympic runner, and then into 2 different set levels of super speed. The Flash would build even more momentum by pulling off tricks in the air, grinding off rails, and running without being stopped. Once he gained enough speed, he could run up the side of buildings and propel himself further through the air. Using a combination of speed, aerial tricks, and combos, he could reach previously inaccessible areas in the overworld. In the final version of the game, he was intended to be able to go faster than he could in any of the prototype builds seen here. Early on, the developers discussed whether or not their version of the Flash would be able to phase through matter, passing through objects as he could in the comics. Including this power posed potential design problems. Communicating to players what they could and couldn't phase through would be difficult, and allowing them to do it with anything in the environment just wouldn't be technically possible. Rather than frustrate the expectations of the player or confuse them, the ability was dropped, and they came up with an alternative. As the player approached high speed, rather than vibrating through obstacles, they would increasingly gain more mass and be able to plow through them with tremendous force. In its prototypes, the game was using a combat system that was very similar to the one invented by Bottle Rocket staff in the Mark of Kree, but with the added twist of the character's superhuman abilities. You would see button prompts floating above enemies, and would then have to tap the corresponding buttons to zip towards them instantly and launch into an attack. A lot of the combat would have been focused on crowd control and negotiating combo moves. There would have been a myriad of different combos you could perform, and it was all about quickly managing which enemy took which part of the combo as you built it up and the blows became more powerful. Landing attacks successfully would fill up a speed force meter on the HUD, granting you access to super-powered special moves. The Flash could run in a circle to create tornadoes, or move so fast that he would generate speed ghosts, mirages of himself that would distract enemies. You would even be able to access the Flash's trademark infinite mass punch. The structure of Bottle Rocket's Flash game worked as followed. The player had access to a map covering both Keystone and Central City, which they could travel between fairly quickly. Objectives would be broadcast to the Flash via a police radio headset implemented into his suit, courtesy of an ally of his monitoring the city. These would be added to his map and would either be obligatory missions needed to advance the story, or side quests that would regularly emerge. Completing these side events was totally optional, but the player was encouraged to complete them by an in-game morality/XP system called the Hero Rating. Essentially, you would gain points towards your hero rating from finishing quests, and this would help you unearth clues, unlocking more story missions and other content. There would have been a wide variety of different optional scenarios for you to interact with. 1 minute Flash could be stopping a carjacking or a bank robbery, the next he could be catching someone falling off a building or saving them from a traffic accident. The catch was that while you weren't forced to do all of these levels, each one of them had a time limit within which you could do them. This was intended to be a subversion of the timed mission mechanic introduced by Dead Rising in 2006. By design, Dead Rising made it somewhat difficult for players to complete all of its timed scenarios before they would expire. You would have to manage your time carefully to decide which to complete and in what order, a frantic twist to create a sense of tension. With the Flash, on the other hand, Bottle Rocket had a character that was logically fast enough to complete multiple objectives like those in a very short space of time. Although you would have a timer for each event, these timers would actually slow down based upon the speed at which Wally was travelling. Finishing these or neglecting them would have far-reaching consequences that would become evident as the player explored the world. If the Flash was more successful and began to resolve a decent amount of them, the environment would change for the better. The civilian population would start to appreciate the Flash more, cheering him on as he passes them. They would paint street art in his honour, stores would start selling Flash-themed products, and the streets would become slightly more busy as people became more at ease. Eventually, as your rating maxed out, you would see them erect statues of the Flash. Central City would open the Flash Museum, and the more you played through the story, the more memorabilia would be added to it to celebrate his victories. Conversely, you could try ignoring the needs of the people and would see the negative side effects of doing so. The populace would start to turn on the Flash as he got less favourable coverage from the news media. As crime figures rose, you'd start hearing distant gunfire and police sirens and seeing buildings being vandalised. This is just a very small sample of the many positive and negative effects they were going to add. The main story was planned to have around 10 to 15 chapters in all, each one revolving around a different member of the Flash's rogues gallery. 11 different bosses had been concepted over the course of development with a variety of unique designs. These included Weather Wizard, Murmur, Captain Boomerang, Pied Piper, The Top, and Mirror Master. Captain Cold was intended as one of the earliest foes you would encounter. After robbing a bank, he attempts to flee using his getaway van. The player would need to keep up with him as he shot at you and coated the roads in ice in an effort to stop you. To beat him, you'd need to ram into him enough to make him crash. After that, he would use a device to generate an ice shield to protect himself. While fending off his henchmen, you would have to break holes in his defense enough to reach him with your attacks. Tar Pit was another fight that they had mapped out, which would have been set in a construction site and would have been one of the largest bosses in the game. Flash would have to zip about avoiding his attacks and making use of the construction equipment around him. He would need to dump concrete on top of him and wait for it to harden before unleashing a special air attack to smash it and weaken him. Some of the other bosses involved less direct confrontation and were more about thwarting their evil plans over simply providing a beatdown. The Trickster, for example, would have dispatched a number of remote control cars with explosives attached to them around the cities. The Flash would have to travel around the map disarming them before they could reach their targets. Eventually, he would obtain enough data from the devices to track the Trickster's location and apprehend him. A version of the shadowy Project Cadmus group from the comics was also said to have a background role in the story. In this appearance, they would have been an evil organization intent on opposing metahumans, in particular the Flash. At one point in the story, they would have captured the original Flash, Jay Garrick, imprisoning him and stealing his blood for their experiments. They would have used it to genetically engineer their foot soldiers to create new enemies for the Flash known as Speed Demons. He would occasionally run into these around the open world, groups of armed soldiers capable of super speed that he would have to defeat by making them crash into oncoming obstacles or slamming them into barriers. Overall, there was a lot of thought and consideration being put into the narrative details making up the world of the Flash, although it would take a while for the true overarching plotline that was weaved throughout the game to come to the foreground. Ultimately, the player would learn that the character that has been feeding you information throughout the whole game via your headset is none other than the Flash's nemesis, Professor Zoom, hiding in plain sight under his civilian alter ego, Hunter Zolomon. Frustrated and tired of being defeated, Zoom enlisted the aid of Gorilla Grodd. Together, they have constructed and hidden a series of devices around the cities. These machines are activated when the Flash taps into the Speed Force to use his powers, and the more this happens, the more energy they consume and disrupt the city. They would start to produce rifts, pulling civilians into the speed dimension itself. Eventually, Wally would come to realize his plan. He has been harvesting energy and trapping people inside it to draw Wally in, since Zoom has a greater level of control over the elements inside the speed dimension. Hunter helping Wally was all a front to manipulate him into using his abilities around the cities. Gorilla Grodd's role was developing new technology for Zoom's machines and secretly enhancing the villains around the cities. Wally would have confronted Grodd and his army of gorillas who were attempting to stage a breakout at Iron Heights prison. A huge brawl between them ensues, eventually ending in Grodd's defeat. As the finale continues, the Flash travels into the speed dimension to face Professor Zoom, liberate the civilians, and put a stop to his plan against the odds. This was about as far as writing on the story had gotten, although Marv Wolfman was still expected to make alterations as they moved forward. Outside of the single player, the team also had planned an online multiplayer mode. This would have pitted up to 4 players against one another in a superpowered race to the finish. You would have been able to choose from a wide selection of enhanced and superhuman individuals, including a Cadmus Speed Demon, the Soviet agent Christina from the Blue Trinity group, Barry Allen, Jay Garrick, John Fox, Max Mercury, The Rival, Impulse, Kid Flash, Jesse Quick, Johnny Quick, XS, Black Flash, and lastly Professor Zoom / Reverse Flash. They also wanted to find a way to make Superman playable in this mode, which would have been a possibility since Brash did own the rights to use him in video games. The Flash video game was in development for just over a year. It was given the working title of The Flash, the Fastest Man Alive, and was on schedule to launch at the end of 2009. Around 30 staff members at Bottle Rocket Entertainment worked on it. At the time, they had the vast majority of the city landscape up and running and were starting to build models for their proposed boss battles, like Mirror Master. The narrative elements were yet to be finalised and no voice actors were ever cast, although the team did have an idea of who they wanted to play Wally West, actor Ryan Reynolds. Work on the title had progressed well as the company comfortably met each deadline given to them. The game's eventual collapse was an unfortunate casualty of huge mistakes made by their publisher Brash Entertainment and was completely beyond their control. Brash had been set up and sold to investors investors on the promise that it would deliver a new gold standard for licensed video games. As of 2008, the publisher had failed to live up to these sentiments. Their management had almost no shared experience of running a game publisher, and most of them had never even worked in the industry. It was a company run out of Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, mostly by film producers and businessmen from backgrounds in other industries. Essentially, they tried to run the business as if it was a Hollywood movie studio, taking on lower budget, lesser quality tie-ins first as a means of funding the more ambitious projects like The Flash that they actually were interested in doing. The managers of Brash cut corners. Desperate for work, they signed contracts with film studios, which forced their developers into making games within extremely short development cycles. Their Jumper video game, for instance, was made in around only 6 months. This bold strategy of theirs didn't pay off. Critics gave scathing reviews to their games, and sales were well below expectations. Their investors began to pull out one after the other as 2008 went on. Altogether, this crippled the publisher financially. Towards the end of the year, their development partners around the world, like Bottle Rocket, inexplicably stopped receiving payments from them. By November, it was official. Brash Entertainment was filing for bankruptcy and ceasing its operations. Without a publisher to fund it, Bottle Rocket was left with no other option but to permanently stop development on The Flash. Bottle Rocket was able to survive into 2009, working with Namco on a reboot of Splatterhouse. However, a tense creative conflict between the two parties led to its demise. Namco, looking for developers who would challenge them less, pulled the project away from them and changed it drastically. Without new work, Bottle Rocket Entertainment was forced to close its doors in September 2009. Today, The Flash, the fastest man alive, survives only in the private collections of former developers. Many of them have held onto and preserved a vast amount of assets from the project, and it stands as a testament to how passionately many of them felt about it. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos for more exclusive looks at lost video games. Unseen64 is an archive for cancelled, unreleased and unseen video games. You can visit the site at unseen64.net. I've been Liam, I hope this video has been of interest, and have fun.